Continuation of Chapter 1. A Patient Charity. St. Pius X then asks the bishops to assure that the priests be charitable. Quote, "But in order that the desired fruit may be derived from this apostolate and this zeal for teaching, and that Christ may be formed in all, be it remembered, venerable brethren, that no means is more efficacious than charity." End quote. The advice given here is really important. Think of the problems that many traditionalists have experienced in their parishes. Priests who lack charity have a tendency to judge men as they should be and not as they are. They close their eyes to the realities. If a young priest comes into contact with souls and has categories in mind, thinking a priori what Christians should be like, he will not receive the sinner who comes to him, and we are all sinners, as a physician of souls, but as a judge. Then he will condemn, rebuke, and scold the penitent, with the result, of course, that people will flee. Imagine that in a hospital a doctor were to say to the patient, "You are too sick, I can't treat you, you have only to die." Or else a doctor who would have recourse to such drastic measures right away, "Your leg must be amputated." Such a doctor might do analyses, but he would have no feel for diagnosis, the sense that so many of our country doctors used to have to such a high degree, and who could guess the nature of the disease right away. Such doctors were loved. The priests, then, must be physicians of souls, says St. Pius X. And he explains, quote, "For the Lord is not in the earthquake." 3 Kings 19:11. It is vain to hope to attract souls to God by a bitter zeal. On the contrary, harm is done more often than good by taunting men harshly with their faults, and reproving their vices with asperity. True, the apostle exhorted Timothy, "Accuse, beseech, rebuke," but he took care to add, "with all patience." 2 Timothy 4:2. Jesus has certainly left us examples of this. "Come to me," we find him saying, "Come to me, all ye that labor and are burdened, and I will refresh you." Matthew 11:28. And by those that labor and are burdened, he meant only those who are slaves of sin and error. What gentleness was that shown by the divine Master! What tenderness, what compassion towards all kinds of misery! Isaiah has marvelously described his heart in the words, "I will set my spirit upon him, he shall not contend, nor cry out. The bruised reed he will not break, he will not extinguish the smoking flax." Isaiah 42:1. This charity, patient and kind, 1 Corinthians 13:4, will extend itself also to those who are hostile to us and persecute us. "We are reviled," thus did St. Paul protest, "and we bless, we are persecuted, and we suffer it, we are blasphemed, and we entreat." 1 Corinthians 4:12. They perhaps seem to be worse than they really are. Their associations with others, prejudice, the counsel, advice, and example of others, and finally an ill-advised shame have dragged them to the side of the impious. But their wills are not so depraved as they themselves would seek to make people believe. End quote. Refrain from hasty conclusions. Truly, harshness is a bad counselor. Right away one draws exaggerated conclusions from a single sentence. The words of others are always taken in the most extreme way. For example, some people reason thus: the Pope has said this, he is therefore a heretic. He is therefore not Pope. Behold an argument that is too simple. It does not suffice, after all, to take a sentence out of context and then rightly conclude he is a heretic. To be a heretic, it is necessary to be pertinacious in adhering to the error. It is not enough to have uttered an heretical phrase. For example, on the subject of the Blessed Trinity, a very difficult subject, we might make a mistake or blunder in speech and say something that is not very orthodox. If someone points it out to us, we retract. But if they accuse us of heresy or excommunicate us, how frightful! Some go so far as to draw the most improbable conclusions. Someone said such a sentence, thus he is a liberal, and if he is a liberal, then he must be a Mason, and so he is excommunicated. With such argumentation, everyone would be a Freemason. So, it is very dangerous to let oneself be drawn into hasty conclusions. Sometimes it is said about the Pope: he signed the decree on religious liberty, but this decree is heretical. Therefore the Pope is a heretic. Therefore the Pope isn't Pope. Firstly, one must study in a very precise way to see if the decree is heretical. Then, one must ask whether the Pope, when he signed it, was quite aware of what he signed. It is known that he himself obliged certain expressions to be added which say, the decree on religious liberty is in conformity with tradition. Of course, this isn't true, but in his own mind the Pope saw it that way. Hence, one cannot conclude too rapidly, the consequences would be too grave. Some say, there is no Pope. Then the cardinals he has named are not cardinals, and when these elect the next Pope, there will be no Pope, because the cardinals were not cardinals. Where does this lead? Who then will designate the new Pope? Providence, yes, but Providence makes use of men. One falls into a black hole. This is where hasty conclusions lead. Is it any wonder that the faithful look elsewhere? They go to Palmar de Troya, where Clemente made himself Pope, and sits with a court of cardinals. They go to the Latin Church of Toulouse, or elsewhere. They have been driven into seeking an authority. They end up by joining the sects. They break away completely from the Church. Thus, one must be very careful and prudent before affirming something. Those who have spoken thus have lacked the spirit of charity, and consequently, realism. They are idealists, speculative reasoners. The priest is a physician of souls. It is the same thing with sinners. When one must examine someone's sin, one must, of course, consider the sin in itself, the action committed that is a grave sin. But it is possible that, subjectively, the penitent is not guilty. Perhaps he didn't know that he was committing a grave sin, or he had been pushed, or conditioned, or at the time he was not conscious of what he was doing. So many circumstances to weigh. To examine things outside of their circumstances is not realistic. Now, once again, the priest is the physician of souls. He must question the penitent or the person who has come seeking advice. How did he do that? How did he get himself into such a situation? Explain so as to try later to give a remedy. This is very important. A priest must begin in the seminary to seek the virtue of prudence. He must not let himself become harsh or enclose himself within arguments by which he leads astray himself and others. Catholic action. Next, St. Pius X considers the question of means. Quote, "It is true, venerable brethren, that in this arduous task of the restoration of the human race in Christ, neither you nor your clergy should exclude all assistance." End quote. The Pope requests the bishops to watch over Catholic action, the society of the faithful who help the priest to spread the teaching that comes from the example of the Christian life. Quote, "For it is not priests alone, but all the faithful without exception, who must concern themselves with the interests of God and souls, not, of course, according to their own views, but always under the direction and orders of the bishop. Our predecessors have long since approved and blessed those Catholics who have banded together in societies of various kinds, but always religious in their aim. We, too, have no hesitation in awarding our praise to this great idea, and we earnestly desire to see it propagated and flourish in town and country. But we wish that all such associations aim first and chiefly at the constant maintenance of Christian life among those who belong to them." End quote. To grasp St. Pius X's ideas on Catholic action, it is necessary to refer to the allocution he pronounced on September 25, 1904. He asks that 3 principles govern Catholic action: piety, study, action. In France, they are familiar with groups like the Catholic Students' Youth Group, JEC, Young Catholic Workers, JOC, Junior Catholic Farmers, JAC, which were formed under the initiative of a Belgian priest, Cardin, who later became cardinal. He took as his motto, "See, judge, act." This is quite different from what Pius X proposed: prayer, study, action. Prayer, one may say, envelops study according to the principles of the Catholic religion, and then comes the action that is commanded by prayer and study. Whereas in the program See, Judge, Act, seeing comes first, which is an action. It is to conduct oneself like all those who accomplish any undertaking. One begins by seeing, then one judges, finally one acts. But how do they see things? How do they judge them? How is their action guided? When I was Archbishop of Dakar, I remember having visited JOC groups. I would point out to them the danger of this motto. First of all, one sees that something goes wrong at work. Then one judges. Why did this go wrong? It is because of the authority, the boss. Then one acts. One must fight the boss. The same thing happens in the parish. Something goes wrong. It is the pastor's fault, and so one must fight the pastor. Thus, one falls into the principle of revolution. These young people think that nothing is ever their fault. The authority is always to blame. This explains how these initially well-intentioned Catholic action movements ended up by becoming revolutionary associations. What is more revolutionary than the ACO, the Workers' Catholic Action? Everything is society's fault, hence one revolts against society. One seeks to change all the institutions. It becomes generalized revolution. Piety First. It is very important to return to the true principles of Catholic action. First of all, prayer. Beg the good God for His grace. Then study the teaching of the Church in order to act in conformity with the principles of truly Catholic action. Such is the normal order. St. Pius X continues, Quote, "Such luminous examples given by the great army of soldiers of Christ will be of much greater avail in moving and drawing men than words and sublime dissertations. And it will easily come about that when human respect has been driven out, and prejudices and doubting laid aside, large numbers will be won to Christ, becoming in their turn promoters of his knowledge and love, which are the road to true and solid happiness." End quote. The result? Quote, "There will certainly be no more need for us to labor further to see all things restored in Christ. Nor is it for the attainment of eternal welfare alone that this will be of service. It will also contribute largely to temporal welfare and to the advantage of human society. For when these conditions have been secured, the upper and wealthy classes will learn to be just and charitable to the lowly, and these will be able to bear with tranquillity and patience the trials of a very hard lot. The citizens will obey not lust, but law. Reverence and love will be deemed a duty towards those that govern, quote, whose power comes only from God. Romans 13:1. And then at last it will be clear to all that the Church, such as it was instituted by Christ, must enjoy full and entire liberty." End quote. St. Pius X, before concluding, expresses a wish. Quote, "May God, who is rich in mercy," Ephesians 2:4, "benignly speed this restoration of the human race in Jesus Christ, for it is not of him that willeth, or of him that runneth, but of God that showeth mercy." Romans 9:16. And let us, venerable brethren, in the spirit of humility, with continuous and urgent prayer, ask this of him through the merits of Jesus Christ." End quote. Then he turns towards the Blessed Virgin. Quote, "Let us turn too to the most powerful intercession of the Divine Mother, with further exhortation that as intercessors with God, appeal also be made to the most pure spouse of Mary, the patron of the Catholic Church, and the holy princes of the Apostles Peter and Paul." End quote. Finally, the Pope gives his apostolic blessing. This beautiful encyclical of Pope St. Pius X practically summarizes all the encyclicals of his predecessors. He puts the accent on what is most important: omnia restaurare in Christo. Today, as in his time, that is the goal of the priesthood.